Tonight I'll be presenting what I call an exploration of web animation. I wanted to see and to research what are the topics that are currently being discussed about animation, and also what are the tools that are being used. Having said that, it is a topic that is very wide, so I selected elements or tools that I find interesting for my work, and I hope that it will be interesting for you too. It is more for me also a way to start a conversation, a discussion about web animation. So please participate if you work in this field and if you want to give a feedback. So again, animation today, just before, my name is Catherine. I'm a course instructor at the EPFL Extension School. I also work on a project that I will discuss a bit further later that is called My Digital Future, and it's a fellowship. Well, end of the... Like when when a website is being loaded, what is very useful to have is, for example, a loader or progress bar. But most also important is to make the user feel that he doesn't or she doesn't wait for a long time. So entertain while the person is waiting. Animations can be used like with buttons. If you click on a button, you want to know what happens. So if the button tells you, for example, that the process is, there's a process behind, and if the process is successful or if there is an error, it is always good to know. Another, like here it's very subtle, you don't even see it, but it's like the small scrolling icon that it tells you to scroll down. Animations can also express a brand personality. It can be quite straightforward, for example, with 7-Up and their bubbles. I don't need to explain. Or it could also serve, like, for example, a design company that, like Paper Tiger, to make the whole experience like more lively and more maybe entertaining and visual for the user. Animations can also tell a story. Here I have 2 examples. There's one that is for a creative festival called Kick Festival, where you have animations based mainly on hovers. You have all the links to on the presentation, so you can see them like more in details once you receive it. They're nice because you have really like subtle animations, and sometimes you, at least for myself, I felt I was more attracted by the animations themselves than the content of the website, which is not always good, but it tells a story. The same with the website of Google called Your Plan, Your Planet, and here everything is made around animation to make you think about how can you, what are your habits around food and energy, and what is the energy, again, you waste when you consume food. There are many studies around web animation, especially when we talk about user experience design. What I find interesting, of course, web animation is related to, it's time-based. So everything related to time is important when you create a web animation. And there are, for example, studies or research that show that an animation should last between 100 to 500 milliseconds, depending on the situation. Below 100 milliseconds, it's too fast and the brain doesn't have the time to process the animation. And above 500 milliseconds, you might feel that there's a problem with the website because it's too slow. So you have to work with the pace and the length of an animation. You also need to make sure that you consider the size of the screen, because if a screen is bigger, the animation should last longer, especially on mobile screens, because it takes more time to go from one side to the other when the screen is bigger, obviously. One feature that I find interesting is that when we think about, again, you have a website that is being loaded, you can use loaders, you can use progress bars, but one feature that has been discussed these last months or maybe years is the skeleton screens, because instead of showing your user that he has to wait, you show the user that things are being loaded and that things are happening and that things will be presented soon, instead of saying, oh, you have to wait because our website is a bit maybe slow, or it takes time to process the data. When it comes to developing web animations, you can use a lot of tools, a lot of technologies. You have CSS, you have CSS preprocessors, you have CSS animations libraries, JavaScript libraries, web animation API. So for me, it was a bit also difficult not to get lost with all these technologies. I selected the ones that speak to me most. And starting with CSS, what we can do with CSS. Why use CSS? There are benefits with it. For example, compared to script-driven animations, CSS can be easier to learn. It can have a simple syntax, but you can make also very complex animations with CSS. It can save your users CPU and battery, but then you'll have to make sure that you work with the right properties, because there are properties that if you change them, can take more time to be processed and can slow your website too. So you have to be mindful about that. When you use CSS, there are three main properties properties that you can use to move elements in a website: CSS transforms, CSS transitions, and CSS animations. Out of the three, there are only two that are time-based. These are CSS transitions and animations. And the difference between the two is that when you have transitions, you go from one state to another state. And with animations, you can have multiple states, so make your animations more granular and more precise. So most of the time, when you have examples on the web, you see CSS animations. If we go back just to the basics of CSS animations, you first have to describe your animation. You have the animation name. For example, here, text focus in. You have the animation length, duration, the time curve. Here, it's a cubic Bezier, but it could be an ease in, ease out. Just the main thing here to have in mind is that it's always good to have an animation that is not linear, but for example, it can start really slow and then move faster, so it looks more natural than like a linear one. And then you describe the steps of your animations with keyframes. So here, for example, you have when at step 0%, you have the opacity is 0 and you have a blur. And when you go to 100%, the opacity is at 1 and the blur is gone. So this is really like a simple example, but to show how a CSS animation can be created. But then, of course, you won't be able to do everything using CSS in some situations. And for example, when you want to control the state of an animation, then you'll have to use JavaScript. And here it's an example showing that, for example, you have a button play, you have a button pause, you have just events. So when you click on the button play, it plays, and when you click on the button pause, it pauses. But this is easier to do, or can be done with JavaScript, controlling your CSS animation. And then you move to, if you want to look into CSS preprocessor, here is an example of an animation made with less. And I don't want to go through the whole code, but just why would you use a CSS preprocessor for an animation? Here, what the obvious reason, for example, is that you can use variables that you can change over time. You can use loops to change the value of a variable, for example. And you can also use what they call mix-ins. So you create your animation, and then you include it in other part of your website. So you create it once, and then you use it in other part of your website. So this is made with, again, a CSS preprocessor, and you don't need, for example, JavaScript to do this. Then there's the question about images. What type of images do you use with animation? And here, I think one of the obvious file format is SVG. Why? Because it's sharp and crisp, whatever the size of the screen, because it's these are vector graphics. And so they're using mathematics to represent the image. It's resolution independent and responsive. SVGs have their own DOM, so you can animate elements of your SVG using CSS, JavaScript, for example, target one element and make it move. So for animation, it's very useful. I have an example here of a simple animation, but when you hover on the animation, the sun moves. And this is made with CSS variables. So CSS variables are also called custom properties, or custom properties for cascading variables, I think. And here, these variables are not the same ones as the ones you use with preprocessors. They're really CSS, proper CSS variables. And these are very useful with animations, because then now you can give a value to a variable. And here, when you hover on the image, the variable changes, its value changes. And you do this with CSS code only, without JavaScript. You have it here. You define properties, for example, the color of the sky and the angle, the degree. And once you hover, the color and the degree changes. It can also become more complex when you have, when you start to use CSS variables with a preprocessor. And here it's an example. The code is quite complex, but what we can get out of it is that there's a CSS click event. So it's a sort of hack. Instead of using a JavaScript event, you have a CSS event. Like when you click on the sun, it goes from sunset to sunrise. And again, here you use custom properties to define the colors of the different elements of the images. You use loops. Loops are useful, again, for animation because, for example, you can define a different delay for each element of the image. Here you have the time, and each element moves at a different, has a different delay thanks to a loop that is in CSS. And again, you use mixins to define these transitions or animation and reuse them in the website, for the animation or for different parts of the animation itself. And then I realized that my presentation is quite short. Maybe I went too fast, I forgot some things. But
Straight to the point.
Sorry?
Straight to the point.
Good. So here a last slide, because I wanted to mention what would be the next steps for my exploration. And mainly, I would like to deep in more into GreenSock animation platform. It is a platform, JavaScript platform for HTML5 animations. I want to dig into this platform because for someone who comes from more a designer background, the way you can create animations is kind of not straightforward, but it's easier to work with compared to other tools, at least for me. So this would be my next step to continue exploring these animations.